When I was London correspondent, and I think I was the first foreign correspondent who Graham personally appointed, and I happened to cop London, which was also by that time included the Northern Ireland and the Middle East. But anyway, he rang and said, I'll fix something me when I arrive, would you? I want a meeting with Ted Heath. You mean the Prime Minister? Yeah, that one. I said, I'll see what I can do. So I went into a panic and rang every old journo I'd ever met who might have any connections with Downing Street, and eventually, to my immense relief, they said, oh yes, the Prime Minister will give him 5 minutes on Thursday morning. So in due course we arrived at number 10 Downing Street, where to my horror I saw there were cameras set up and all sorts of things, all of them organised by Perkin, so that he had a photograph of the occasion of him entering the doors of number 10 Downing Street. And that photo, I think, is the most repeated photograph of Perkin that there is anywhere.
It was a time of Vietnam, and the North was sort of getting on top, and it was just before the footy season started. And so I did this cartoon, and I offered to Les. Les was relieving that night, and I offered him this cartoon. And I had the little poster, a little man walking up to it, and it said, North beats South. And of course, the astute population of Victoria responded. The bloke said, must have been a practice match. And I offered it to Les, and he knocked it back. The next night, the issue obviously was still going, and I offered it to Perkin. And fair enough, next day it went in the paper. And then Perkin called me over and said, Trambo, did you offer that cartoon to me last night knowing that Les Carline had rejected it the night before? I said, yes. Do that again, Trambo, and I'll kick you in the balls.
Tim Colbert could tell this story better than me, but Tim came on as a graduate cadet, and he had some kind of expertise on the subcontinent in India, and he'd travelled there and he knew all about it and done an honours degree. And one night he picked up one of the leaders, which were, sort of hanging on a spark or whatever they were, and he read this editorial about some sort of political thing happening in India. And he walked up to Perkin and said, this is all wrong. It wasn't the Ganges, it was whatever, and Mrs. Gandhi didn't say, or I forget the detail, but he berated him that this was all wrong. And then he walked away, and Perkin looked around the subs desk and said, who the fuck was that?
Well, you certainly knew when Graham had an audience in his office, because he'd come over fairly sort of abrupt and aggressive. I remember one occasion, I rang him actually, and he said, right, why aren't you in Northern Ireland, Belfast? And I said, I am in Belfast, Northern Ireland. There was a slight pause, and he said, who the hell gave you permission to go to Northern Ireland? You couldn't win with Graham. In the matter of upstaging, he was the man.
It was the day that I arrived. I hadn't even started work. I was due to start work the next day. And I went in, and the first question my Ron Lovett asked me, the pictorial editor, was what team are you going to follow? I don't really know what you're on about. I said, but I will become a member of the first club that I take a picture of. And he said, good. He said, we all follow Essendon around here. He said, Neville's going out. He said, there's a camera with a telephoto lens, and he said, and you can go out with him. I wandered out in the middle of the ground, and there was 6 guys lined up in a straight line, weights in their hands. And on command, they were jumping in the air. And I took a picture, and it looked like this guy all you could see was the guy in the front, but he had 6 pair of legs under him. And I used it on page 1 the next day. And I got into work at 9 o'clock, and Graham Perkin walked down, shook me by the hand, and he said, great effort yesterday. He said, there's a little present for you. And it was a week's pay in an envelope.
After I'd been there a couple of weeks, this was in 1974, he said, now look Ken, the chairman, Colonel Neil, colonel of the former British Army in Burma, who was married into the Syme family, was hosting a lunch. So up we went to the 5th floor, where the colonel had his office. We walked into the room. The colonel, if you can imagine, a very pucker Englishman, launched into this story about how at the weekend he'd been flying with one of his friends from Melbourne to Adelaide at a high level in the atmosphere above the storm down below, which was buffeting these commercial jets. And in the midst of this story, which didn't seem to bear much relation to anything, Perkin leaned across the table in a very loud voice to ensure that he would hear. He said, "Well, Ken, that is real boy's own stuff, isn't it?" And the interview finished slightly after this, and as we're walking out the door, Perkin said, again in a very loud voice so the colonel would hear, he said, "Well, Ken, what did you think of that?" And I said, "Well, it was quite interesting." And he said, yes, by that stage the door was open but not closed. He was in the corridor and it was perfectly stage managed. He said, "Yes, Ken, it shows you what you can do if you get your dick in the till."
I'm told the night before I came that he called together the newsroom and he told them that there's a young girl who's coming in, and the first man who touches her, who lays a finger on her, will lose their job. Now, as we know, he might as well have just held up a flag and said, "Have a go, boys." But I think he meant very well. No one was killed or sacked, but they should have been. A number of them should have been.
In '74, Tony Feder and Russell Skelton got on board a light plane to photograph sharks in the bay. They got over the top of them. The pilot stalled the plane when he went into a turn, and the plane went in to 25 feet of water.
The plane crashed and we both ended up in intensive care in the Alfred. And the next morning, Tony came to, and Tony said, "Oh, Jesus, that was terrible, terrible. I was convinced I died. I'd gone to heaven." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Well, I dreamt that I woke up in the middle of the night and there was Perkin on the end of the bed in a bathrobe amongst all the mist, and peering at me, telling me I was okay." And as it turned out, of course, Perkin had been in the hospital, had been sitting on his bed, and been there for a minor procedure of some sort, and was trying to actually tell Tony he was all right and he's going to survive.